So today's deep dive lessons, apart from just practicing the PFV method, I also try to convey a specific set of lessons today. One is that the PFV method, use it as a principle. It's not an exact method. This is about teasing apart these variables that we can make reliable forecasts for, rather than go straight at maybe the valuation or the price itself, or just using the quality of the company and say that I buy quality companies no matter the price. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. So sometimes what we do is we use sales growth and EV to sales multiples. That's the easiest, most straightforward application of the PFV method. But sometimes we can look to book equity, for example. What we're after is a fundamental variable or a way of looking at the real value creation of the company. What we want to do is see how will the future cash flows or equity base or any other fundamental variable for the company, how will that progress into the future, either starting right now with its long-term trend, or at some point in the future if we think that is easier. It's simply if we think that is easier that we do that. If we think it's easier to start right away, right today, and say it is already normalized, then we do that and just project the evolution from, or the development from 1 year, for 1 year at a time. And I think that was a good way to do it for Equinor. It probably actually is a good way in general for resource companies. So that is also a lesson today, that PFV is not an exact method. It's a way of looking at valuations and how to analyze a stock. But we also, I think, learned the lesson that resource companies are a different animal from what I would call more operational companies, like a manufacturing company or a service company. Just as real estate companies and banks are also quite different from these normal operation-based companies that we are used to talking about. The reason is that the value driver for a company like Equinor is an external variable. It's the global price for oil. And for banks, it's their core equity tier 1 ratios. They have a sum of money that they use for creating more money. They lend it out, and there's a regulatory requirement for how much capital you need to have available at all times in order to meet the requirement from the clients. So that's rule 1. And we should also note from the example of Equinor is that sometimes we need to do detailed forecasting of the fundamental variables. We need to go more into detail than usual to be sure of what we're talking about. So in Equinor's case, it could be analyzing both the volume of what they are selling, so numbers of barrels of oil. We really should have done that to see how stable are those, how much oil are they getting out of the ground at any point in time. And then also on top of that, checking unit prices, so analyzing not sales or sales growth or sales levels, but actually the volumes of barrels of oil. Because that is the leading value creation part that Equinor is actually has control over themselves. And in order to get to earnings per share, we shouldn't just assume some kind of a profit margin, because we saw that those varied wildly, as did their return on equity. Instead, we need to go and analyze costs separately. So both variable costs, that would be their all-in sustainable cost of extraction, of getting the stuff out of the ground and refining it and getting it to clients. And then on top of that, their fixed costs, the costs of their headquarters, their staff, their premises, all of that stuff. Because when you have a company like Equinor, where the income is completely separate from their cost base, then you also need to analyze them separately. Whereas for an operational company, they typically have variable input costs for every sale they do, and that lends it to a much more stable profit margin over time, and therefore you can actually analyze earnings per share directly rather than having to go through all these motions of analyzing costs separately. And so the general lesson here is that you need to do the type of forecasting and the type of teasing apart of variables that you need to do. And you know what you need to do because once you get to a set of variables that behave smoothly and exhibit stable patterns, that is when they are smooth and stable and reliable and forecastable. So the second lesson is about what the real risks involved are. With risk, I mean the risk of a permanently lower profit or a permanently a negative surprise of a permanent nature. That means that the cash flow levels of past, they are not coming back. The problem with a company like Equinor is that the risks are of a type that we don't have control over whatsoever, since they are regulatory and political, not to mention the entire development of the environmental movement. Also we don't know, we don't even know if a private equity company could make a takeover of a company like Equinor because of these regulatory risks. If you are a private equity company, you want to know what you can make with the company and what type of margins and cash flows in order to lever it up, etc. So there are the important lesson here is to really dig into the risk situation for a company. In this case, you should come to the conclusion that you have no idea. So that creates a much higher requirements for the valuation. You should really hope for getting the value back in just a few years, rather than have to wait for 10, 20, 30 years as you usually do for a more normal company. That said, if things simply stay the same, it is really cheap. It is. But the cheapness is reflected in a lot of other companies as well, as we saw. I mean, it's very easy to just make a screen in FinViz on cheap companies, and you'll get a ton of suggestions. And it's probably more interesting to buy a PE7 type company in the gold space or silver space or uranium space than it is in the oil space, even though you maybe think you can understand oil better, since it actually has a use case. And if you're an oil bull, then you definitely have a good upside, because the oil is needed. Anyway, just remember what we learned here is that the risk aspect is especially important when you deal with a company like this that looks cheap. Finally, the third lesson is one about context. You have to be aware of value traps, of Ponzi schemes, of too good to be true stocks, TGTBT stocks. What you should do whenever you find a company that is this cheap is that you should put some energy into finding similar companies, similarly cheap companies. You should do a bubble sort of these. With that I mean you compare them on an apples-to-apples basis in terms of valuation multiples, growth potential, regulatory risks, other specifics concerning these companies and just simply see which one of the deep value prospects you have, which one is the better and with the lower or at least acceptable level of risk. What I really want to convey here is that deep value investing, it takes true deep diving and deep research. An oil company might look very inexpensive and cheap and attractive, especially if you have only seen one, like Equinor. Then you think that that is the only one that exists, and that you have to buy it now, unless you'll miss the opportunity. But my message here is, when you see a company that is this cheap, you should immediately try to find other ones like it in the same sector or in other sectors. Just do a wide search in any type of screening software, because you are bound to find companies like it, and that will make you take a step back and realize that there is no rush to invest in the company like that. Rather, you should spend extra amount of time to really understand why it is that cheap and what could possibly change the situation. Is there anything that could change Equinor's situation? Well, we did see, looking at their share price, that sometimes you have a development in the external world that creates a huge difference, at least for some period of time, like here and here and here and here. It does happen. You just don't know when. So you probably need a lot of patience as well once you start digging into these deep value cases. And unless you really know what you're doing, my guess is that patience will not be enough. It takes a lot of experience to truly understand these cases and know which one has the better prospects. That said, that's it for this Equinor deep dive. And just remember, these are not recommendations to buy or sell. This is a way to convey the method of P equals F times V. It's a method that shows you the beginnings, the framework of how you can start to investigate companies like this. But it really takes more than just an hour to truly understand if it's a good investment prospect or not.